Chapter 6. Cassie had popped her head in Marcus and saw her brothers exactly where she had left them last night. "What do you think one wears to a new realm full of fairies?" she asked. "I would assume a dress, sister, since the only two I have met have worn dresses," Marcus answered seriously. "Right," she nodded. "See you both in 30 minutes," she said and popped back out. They were all waiting for her, and assumed she would be coming down the stairs. Instead, she walked in from the front doors. She looked up surprised to see them all waiting. If they had thought she looked beautiful last night, then stunning was the word they used today. Her hair was wind-blown and wild. She wore a long blue dress, and her bare feet were covered in sand. She smiled at them all and said, "Good morning." "Were you at the beach?" asked Marcus. She tilted her head slightly and said, "Yes. How did you know?" He pointed at her sandy feet. "Of course. The life of a fae is never boring," she said brightly, looking down at her feet. "Do you need a change?" asked Cassia, assuming she had lost track of time. "No, and I invite you to take your shoes off if you want to. The Fey realm feels wonderful on your feet." "You look absolutely beautiful, Cassia. I think you will love the Fey realm," she said excitedly. Cassia had chosen a loose silk dress in a nude color, and she slipped her shoes off. The marble felt cold on her bare feet. Sawyer saw the other two girls had chosen tight tank tops knotted at the stomach and shorts with flip-flops. She felt sorry for them. They had been turned too young. They hadn't let go of high school yet, and they were immortal now. She knew if they made it to a century, they would both be bitter and felt like they had never gotten to live their lives before they were changed. "Is everyone ready?" she asked the group. "Obviously. That's why we're all standing here," Hunter said sarcastically and rolled her eyes. "It's nice to see you're just as pleasant in the morning as you are in the evening," Cassia said to her, and her stare told Hunter to stop talking. "You will see the edge of the realm. It looks like a wall of water. Just walk through it. There's nothing to be afraid of. When we arrive, Astrid will greet us and take you ladies to look around. The rest of you will be taken to see Mother," Sawyer explained. "I'm going wherever Liam goes," Hunter stated. Sawyer turned to her and said, "You most certainly are not. You are being allowed into the Fey realm, and you are a guest there. You do not demand anything, or you will remain here. If you continue to try to assert yourself in every decision I make, then I will ask you to leave this house. I have tried patience with you, Hunter, and now I have run out of it. I understand you are afraid to lose Liam, and I sympathize with you, but I am done tolerating your attitude and your disruptions. I hope I have made myself clear, because I won't say this again." Liam squeezed her arm tightly to warn her to keep quiet. Hunter just nodded in acknowledgement, not trusting herself to speak. Two of the staff came and gripped the heavy red curtain in the middle and walked in opposite directions to open it. A wall of what looked like water was behind it. It shimmered but made no sound. This was the doorway to the Fey realm. It continued to waver and shimmer like it was moving, but you couldn't see through it to the other side. Sawyer started walking toward it, and everyone followed her. As she got close to it, she could see everyone was unsure, and as she stepped to the threshold, she wondered who would step with confidence, and whose step would be unsure. As if to answer her question, Cassia stepped forward and linked arms with her and said, "Ready." Sawyer nodded and took a step. Sawyer's feet touched the thick, soft grass of the realm. To her, stepping through always felt like stepping through cool, wet air. She loved the feeling of the grass in the Fey realm. The dirt beneath it was soft, and it warmed her feet. She had spent many days just lying on her back here, looking up at the clouds through the trees. She turned to make sure everyone had made it through, and watched as they took in the landscape of the realm. It was green everywhere, and the grass seemed to go on forever. There were massive trees and flowers in every color, some colors they had never even seen. It smelled clean and fresh here, like the air was somehow different. They could see Faye walking around everywhere, and all of them were smiling and singing. They all wore dresses and had long hair, and of course they were all barefoot. Sawyer saw Astrid walking towards them with another woman. When they reached her, both gave Sawyer a warm hug and greeting. The other woman nodded at Cassia, who was still linked to Sawyer, and asked, "Who is your new friend?" "This is Cassia. Cassia, let me introduce you to Luna." Luna pulled Cassia into a warm hug. Cassia was not the kind of person who liked to be touched, but she surprised herself and sank into the embrace. She was surprised herself even more when she found herself hugging the stranger back. She had no idea why, but for somehow her hug was like a mother's touch. Luna held her out at arm's length and said, "Welcome, Cassia." "Thank you," Cassia answered, rendered almost speechless by the encounter. Luna then stepped towards the other two girls. "Who do I have the pleasure of meeting now?" she asked them. Hunter, who usually hadn't too much to say, was tongue-tied by this woman. She was already caught off guard by walking through the realm. She was starting to realize that Sawyer's powers were far greater than she had imagined. She had believed Sawyer was delicate and couldn't possibly be stronger than her, but she was starting to rethink that. She had assumed before that if they came, that if Sawyer tried to take Liam from her, she would destroy her. Looking around her now, she knew she had no chance and would have to change her strategy. Brexley finally stuck her hand out and said, "I'm Brexley, and this is Hunter." Luna ignored her outstretched hand and gathered her in a hug, and then gathered Hunter into one. "Welcome to you both. I'm excited. We rarely have visitors here, and Astrid is going to show you around," she said, and Hunter, still without a voice, nodded. Luna turned back to Sawyer and said, "I've missed you, sweet girl," and put her hands on both sides of her face and kissed her forehead. Sawyer looked up at her and said, "I've missed you also." "What an exciting time for you, though. Almost to your soul sing and about to receive your full power. Now introduce me to these young men before Astrid leaves to show these girls around," she said to Sawyer, and turned to face the men. Luna had been given the honor of raising the baby that had been created. She had rocked Sawyer as a baby and soothed her when teeth erupted in her tiny mouth. She had never had a child of her own, and thanked the earth when she was given to the care of Sawyer. She considered her to be her daughter, and she knew Sawyer thought of her as a mother. She wanted now to look at the man who would be her daughter's soulmate. Luna looked at them all and let her gaze return to Sawyer's soulmate. She looked at the man and immediately recognized her daughter's soul when she saw him. He was perfect for the young girl, and she smiled at him for a moment. She turned her attention back to Sawyer, who was pointing to each man and giving her their names, and each man greeted her with a handshake. She didn't try to hug them, especially Sawyer's soulmate. She was afraid she would hold him too tightly and he would know. One of the Fae's abilities was to feel others' emotions. Mother had blocked the four men from Sawyer, and she could not feel what they felt. She did not want Sawyer to become fixated on her soul's mate to the exclusion of the others. She wanted Sawyer to form true friendships before she fell in love. She had not understood Mother's decision at the time, but now facing them she did. Their connection was strong, but would be stronger if love was based on friendship. Even now their ethereal cords were tied to each other, trying desperately to reach out. She smiled at the desperation of it, the two cords tugging desperately to connect. She knew that the night of her soul sting it would be a beautiful thing to behold. Mother had always been the most powerful Fae because she had been the only one created. The rest of them were born to Fae mothers and human fathers. So Mother was the only pure Fae. The others only had half of the power because of their human blood. Mother could control all of the elements. Mother had been born fully formed, and this was at the age of 22. She did not have to grow and learn. She was brought into the world with full power and knowing her purpose. Sawyer was the first full Fae created since Mother. Mother had planted a young bullish soul, and it had turned into a large plant. On the day of her birth, a flower grew up from the center of it. The Fae stood around it and sang Sawyer into the world. She was just a tiny baby, and when she opened her beautiful green eyes, she smiled at them all. Sawyer had grown into a powerful Fae, and at a young age only Mother could instruct her in her powers because she was already stronger than the rest. Mother still had the ability to block her senses with the men, but when she had her full power, Mother would have a hard time. Sawyer was meant to be as powerful as Mother. They exchanged pleasantries, and then Astrid said, "Well, I should take these ladies and show them around. Mother awaits you all." They started in opposite directions, Luna walking ahead of them with Sawyer. The two women talked easily of the last 24 hours, and the men took in the landscape. They were walking towards an incredibly large redwood tree in the distance. "Have you ever seen anything like this before?" Julius asked Marcus, motioning towards the entire place. "Never. I can't believe we have lived so long and never even had a hint that any of this existed. I thought we were amazing creatures with powerful abilities, but this makes us seem like we're apes." A few feet behind them, Lucas and Liam also chatted about their experience so far. How did it go with Hunter last night? Lucas asked. As well as could be expected when dealing with her being crazy. And it's like trying to calm a chained tiger. I kept telling her that she has nothing to worry about and we're only here for you, but she doesn't care, Liam said. And Lucas thought he was looking a little bit afraid. You need to talk to her again. She's pushing it, and we have no idea what Sawyer can do. She isn't safe if we don't know what to expect, Lucas said, and Liam nodded. Lucas had no love for Hunter, but his brother was all he had left in the world, and he didn't want to see him unhappy. Hunter might be a little crazy, but she made him happy for now. They had gotten closer to the tree and could see it clearly now. They saw a very old woman who was sitting on a chair that was covered in moss. It looked as if it had grown out of the tree naturally and had designs all around it, and the arms and the back were delicate and ornate. They didn't look like they had been carved in either. It looked like they had grown that way naturally. The oldest woman they had ever seen sat in the chair. She had long white hair that hung down over her lap. Her face was covered in wrinkles, as were her hands that held the top of the cane. She looked positively ancient, although her eyes were bright and alert. They remembered what Sawyer had said about a fae aging 1 year for every 10,000, and couldn't imagine how old this woman must be. Her left arm rested on the arm of the chair, and her right hand held her cane. The cane looked like it was made out of petrified wood, and had the same designs as the chair. Sawyer ran to her and kissed both of her cheeks. "Hello, Mother," she said. The old woman looked at her and smiled. "My sweet girl, I've missed you. You were like fresh air to this old woman." "Thank you," she said, and kissed her again. The woman waved her away. "You and Luna go catch up. I must speak to these four." Luna and Sawyer turned and walked away. Sawyer gave them all a small wave as she left. Mother looked at them all just standing and staring at her and laughed. "You four, come sit here in front of me and stop trying to guess my age." They sat down on 4 stumps in front of her that looked like they occurred naturally from the earth. She laughed and said, "I will give you a hint. I'm as old as time and not a day older." They all looked like children who had gotten caught with their hand in a cookie jar, because they had all been thinking exactly that. She gazed at each of them, and yet it felt as though she was looking at them individually. It was impossible to tell if she was speaking to them directly or to someone else. She looked for a long time before she spoke again. "I see your face has changed since you were a child, but your eyes remain the same. Time has changed your heart, but not your eyes, boy." She smiled for a moment and looked off into the distance as if she were remembering that day. She looked back to them again and said, "I'm sure you're full of questions, but I'm not going to answer any of them. In time, all of your questions will find answers. I will explain some things to you today, and time will explain everything else when it is ready. I will start at the beginning of my story so you can understand how we came to the beginning of your own story. I was created by the earth itself at a time when man first appeared on it. My purpose was to teach men how wonderful the earth was and how it could provide for all their needs. In the beginning, I thought the problem with men was their nomadic nature. They kept moving to follow the food sources, but I would soon learn this wasn't the problem. Men have always been violent creatures, and to this very day, I do not understand why. They kill to eat, although they don't have to. It would be okay that they eat meat if that's what they have a taste for, but it's never enough. They simply love violence. They like the power that it brings them. They will destroy an entire village and take nothing from it because somehow they feel power when they do. They will rape or torture or murder and feel power inside of them afterwards. It's been this way since first man, and it has never stopped. They wage their wars between countries, clans, tribes, neighborhoods, or cities. They're never content and will always seek more power. They could be warm and well fed and still never be content. They always want more and are never satisfied. But how can that be? The power they seek isn't real. They are convinced that their violence is the way to gain more power. Sadly, this power isn't real, but they will never understand. They will continue to seek it, for that is the way of men. When I was young, though, I believed they could be different. I had daughters with them. My daughters had daughters with them, and we walked among them. I became convinced that if men could see the true beauty and nurturing that women bring, that they would stop looking for power through violence. I believed that they would find the power that exists in all things to be enough to quell their need for violence. I traveled among them, and myself and my daughters kept homes with them. We tried to teach them how to feel the real power, but only the females would listen. Some learned how to feel the life force and channel it. We tried to bring peace to a species that did not want it. Now, I do not say that every man is prone to violence, but the majority are, and they always become the leaders. It has become so accepted that it's called justice. I have seen a starving man killed because he was caught stealing food. The man who killed him was cheered for giving the people justice, and so it has become twisted. Instead of feeding a starving man, it is justice to punish him. Society is now based on violence, and it is accepted. I'd begun to retreat to the solitude of nature when I began to discover that men were trying to harness the power of the Fae for their own gain, and the women were using it for purposes of punishment. A witch could curse someone for money and use the power of the life force for punishment. It was then that I had had enough, and I created this realm. We retreated from the world of men and have become nothing more than a memory that is disguised as a tall tale. They are not called fairy tales because they are called fairy tales because no one can remember a time when they were true. So we exist only in your realm when we want to, and we travel under the cover of people thinking we are witches. This realm is as your realm was meant to be. I visit your realm from time to time just to see if anything has changed, and sadly it never does. It was during one of those times that I happened upon you. I found you alone in the forest, and you were laying by a tree, hugging it and crying. I had never seen such sadness and was moved by the tree being how you sought comfort. I took pity on you and gathered you in my lap. You told me your reason for crying, and in that moment I thought my own heart would break. You touched me in a way I did not think someone from the world of men could. We made an agreement that day, you and I. I would take away your pain if you gave me half of your soul. With it, I would create for you a never-ending love. But I had seen your fate for the change and told you it would be a very long time. You agreed, and when I took your soul, I took from you that memory. I took from you the agony of the weight you faced. I know none of you have this memory because it now belongs to me. I will give it back to you when it is time. I tell you this now for two reasons. The first is because when your soul connects to Sawyer, this memory will be returned to you. I took your sadness and pain that day, and I will be giving it back. You have spent your life not feeling this pain and not feeling remorse for your actions. That day will end, and you will have to deal with your feelings. I want you to be prepared, but you will have Sawyer by your side when the time comes, and she will guide you through it. She is all the joy and happiness you wished for on that day long ago. She is your wish come true. Cherish her always. The second reason is on that day when I created Sawyer for you, I created the most powerful Fae. She will become even more powerful than me, and only you have the power to calm her. You will be the only reason she has for coming back to us when the power takes over. She looks frail, like she should be protected, but I assure you she does not. Like the earth, she can be nurturing, or she can destroy. Nothing has the power to stop a hurricane or a volcano, destroying everything in its path. This will be her power, and nothing will be able to stop her. You must help her control it, and it is what you were created for. You both have a fate that is tied to the other. Yours will be the only voice that she will be able to hear when this happens. Listen closely to my words today, because sooner than you think, you are fated to save one another. I know this all must be overwhelming to you, but keep in mind that only one of you will be your soulmate. Three of you will leave here, and nothing will have changed in your life. There will be feelings of jealousy and competition. Do not let those emotions rule you. Her soulmate won't ever change. It can only ever be one of you, and that person has already been decided. You have the opportunity to make a new friend who you will all need in the future. Take the time and get to know one another without any expectations. I hope this has answered some questions for you, but like anything in life, I'm sure it has only left you with more questions. The answers will come when it is time for them. She tapped her cane on the ground, and the men felt a vibration. They could see in the distance that Luna and Sawyer had started back for them. She stared at them all again and said quietly, I see so much of you in her. But of course they had no idea which one of them she was actually speaking to. As they stood up to leave, Lucas stepped forward and offered his hand to Mother. "It was nice to meet you," he said as they shook. "Thank you for coming. I will see you on the night of the Solsting," she answered. The other three stood behind him to shake her hand and say goodbye. She bid them each farewell with a promise of seeing them again soon. By this time the two women had arrived, and after kissing Mother with promises of coming soon from Sawyer, they all turned to walk away. Liam found himself walking next to Luna as they headed back for the entryway to their own room. "Do you know the origin story of the boy?" he asked her. "Yes, we all know the story, but it is the same one she just told you," she answered. "Are there more details? She was pretty vague when she was telling it," he asked. "No, you will find Mother is vague about everything. She can see the future, but she says that it is ever changing because of choices that are made. She gives no hints or advice concerning it." "I just think it would be easier if we each had some clue to which one of us it might be," he said, frustrated. "Knowing whether it was you or not won't make things easier, Liam. Whatever doubts you may carry, you must figure out on your own," she said. "I didn't say anything about doubts," he answered. "You didn't have to. It's obvious. And it has nothing to do with Sawyer," she said knowingly. Lucas found himself next to Sawyer and worked up the nerve to begin a conversation. He wasn't sure why he was so nervous around her, but he knew he had to get over it if he was going to get to know her. "So you were born here?" he asked. Sawyer, who had been looking down, admiring the patch of clover they were walking through, looked up, surprised to hear his voice. "I was born here in this realm, but mostly raised in the human realm," she answered. "So you got to come here all the time, though?" he said, just forcing himself to ask questions because her voice distracted him. "Yes, I came whenever I wanted, and when it was time to practice my powers. Mother was my teacher, for that mostly, and she does not like to leave this realm often," she answered. "You went to regular school, though, with human kids, right?" "Yes, I also went to college with human kids," she said and laughed. "Which one?" "I just graduated from Harvard. And what about you? Did you ever go to college or regular school?" she asked. Lucas whistled. "That's pretty impressive." Then shyly he said, "I tried once, but felt like I was more noticeable in the classroom setting. We had tutors growing up, so never in a modern sense." "Astrid told me you were afforded a fine education in your time. I'm fascinated by all of you, and of the Fae. I wonder what it's like to see so many different time periods and see how things change," she said wistfully. "At the time we were educated, it was more suitable for a young English lord to have tutors. We had different ones for different subjects, and even for archery and writing. It was a status symbol back then. The more tutors you had, the better your family looked. Then we were shipped off to court, and that was an education in itself," he said, raising his eyebrows. "Before your change, what were your plans for the future?" she asked. Neither of us had a plan. Our lives were dictated by station and sex. It took away any pressure to know what you wanted, because you didn't have a choice. It wasn't until after the change that Liam and I discovered we were completely unprepared for the real world outside of the monarchy," he answered. "That's why I'm grateful I was raised the way I was. I was made to go to school every day and play sports and make friends. I didn't always understand. I wanted to be here with the Fae and use my powers whenever I wanted, like they did. I'm glad, though, I wasn't sheltered from the real world and its problems, and I learned to control my powers. Some Fae are never able to leave the realm because they don't know how to control their powers. It is not safe for them in the human realm," she said. "I'm not sure that growing up in that mansion was exactly normal," he said jokingly. Sawyer laughed at this and said, "Well, you may have a point. Everyone always did want to come to my house for sleepovers." It was then that Astrid and the girls had caught up with them. They had spent their time touring the houses of the Fae. It had been amazing to see how they all built their own houses in this realm. Some had built grass huts, others regular wooden houses, and some lived in teepees. There were tree houses, and some had turned caves into their homes. Every time period throughout history had been represented in a variety of homes here. It had been fascinating, and Hunter's usual demeanor had been replaced by sheer wonderment. Hunter was relieved when she saw Sawyer laughing and talking to Lucas. She loved Liam, and the thought of him with Sawyer was destroying her inside. She saw Liam with the older Fae and smiled and waved at him. He waved back but didn't return her smile, and just like that, Hunter was in a bad mood again. Astrid and Luna walked to the wall, and both women said goodbye to them all. Luna lingered on her hug with Sawyer and kissed her cheeks. She would be a woman too soon, thought Luna. As they walked back through the realm and the girls collected their shoes, everyone wondered what was next. They looked at the clock and noticed only 1 minute had passed, although they felt like they had been gone for hours. Well, Liam, I guess we should get started. Would you like to get changed and go riding, she asked. Sure, how about I meet you back here in 30 minutes, he agreed. Perfect. My staff has left some riding clothes in your room. I'll see you soon, she said, and headed for her rooms to change. She turned to the other men before starting up. I shall meet you in the music room afterwards, she said to Lucas. Sounds good as long as I don't get lost, he said and smiled. My staff will be happy to show you where it is, she smiled. Marcus, shall we say 2 p.m. in the library, she said, turning to him. I look forward to it, he answered seriously, and she smiled as formality. Julius, 6 p.m. is a good time for a walk, she asked. Will we be walking on the beach, she asked, referring to her feet this morning. She smiled at him and answered, If you want to, we will, and then winked. She turned back to the stairway and started climbing it to go change. Cassia watched Sawyer interact with her brothers. In all her centuries, she had ever only loved 2 people. She had been young when Julius was born and did not have a memory of how she had been before he came along. She assumed she had been a regular little girl and must have loved her parents, but she wasn't sure. She did, however, remember after he was born. She watched her mother ignore and neglect the small baby. She took over his care because even at her young age, she knew he would die if she didn't. Her relationship with her mother became strained over Julius. She watched her dote on Marcus and call him her little soldier. She fed him the best cuts of meat while only saving garbage scraps for Julius, who could not eat until everyone else had. Cassia learned to keep Julius with her at all times and never leave him alone with her mother. She fed him from her plate and tucked him into her bed at night because he was only given a thin blanket and told to sleep on the floor. She was the only comfort he would ever know. When he was still a toddler, she crafted him a small animal from fur and moss. It was an ugly-looking thing and did not resemble the squirrel she was trying to make, but he loved it nonetheless. To this day, he kept it in a glass box in their home. It was tattered and falling apart, and it was his greatest treasure. Marcus, to his credit, had been wonderful to Julius. He would not become the spoiled child his mother wished him to be, and he would not tolerate cruelty to his brother in front of him. He would scoop food from his plate onto Julius's and began to refuse to eat if Julius could not eat with him. The 3 of them formed a bond that revolved around Julius. They would leave for the forest for days when they got older to camp together. They loved leaving the stench of the city behind and thought nothing of being gone for a week. No one considered letting small children wander off into the woods in this day and age, but in their time it had been normal. Children would start working as young as 5 in their time, and girls were married at 12. Children were not coddled and protected. They were expected to help in the home and grow up quickly. They would build fires and spend the day hunting or picking berries for their dinner. When the night fell, they would put Julius between them as they slept. Cassia remembered how sweet of a child he had been despite their parents' cruel treatment. Their father was completely different with Julius. Where their mother ignored him, their father focused all his attention on him. He was only home sporadically as he was always being called away to fight in one campaign or another for Rome. The leaders sought glory through battle and could never have enough glory. Her father was never home longer than a month, but Julius would suffer bruises and broken bones when he was. She sometimes wondered if their family might have been normal if Julius had never been born. Her father and mother were obviously deeply in love. Their faces would light up when they saw one another. He would pick her up and swing her around. They called each other my love and smiled and laughed together constantly. When he came, he would scoop up Marcus and walk him around, asking him questions and bringing him carved statues he had made for him while he was gone. They were delicate and elaborate and made of whatever wood he would find. There were horses and soldiers, and Marcus had a full regiment of them. He would pat Cassia on the head and remark on what a beauty she was becoming, and speak of her marrying well. He never brought her anything, and she never felt a real connection to him. She thought he considered her beauty a commodity he had planned for when she was old enough, but until then he was uninterested in her. He never knew her, and she never really knew him. He would never acknowledge Julius when he was home. Julius would on occasion try to talk to him and tell him something like how well he was doing on his sword practice. Their father refused to even look at him though, and on the occasion he did, it was always with violence. It would be for the smallest reason, and there would be no warning, just blows suddenly striking Julius. Once he was caught Marcus and Julius playing with the horses and soldiers. Wordlessly he picked up Julius from the floor and threw him across the room. He then told Marcus the toys were only meant for him. One night, not too long after that, Cassie had watched Marcus throw them into the fire one by one. He would not be commanded by toys, nor would he let Julius suffer because of them. When Marcus and Julius had joined the army together, Cassia had felt lost. She had no real relationship with her mother or anyone else. She wanted to be free of her mother's household, but it was not done in that time. Girls stayed in their parents' home until they were married. One fateful day, as she was walking through the marketplace, a wealthy merchant spotted her. Titus Aurelius had made his fortune in the slave trade. When he saw Cassia, he decided she would be his wife and bear his heirs. He had grandiose plans on running for the Senate, but Roman society demanded he have a proper wife before they would consider a man of his ilk. While he had the money to become senator, he lacked the refinement that their society demanded. He knew that a young, beautiful wife would help pave his way into politics and Roman society. He spent weeks pursuing her. He sent exotic silks and spices to her home. He sent beautiful jewelry and made extravagant promises. He would come in the evening and have dinner with Cassia and her mother. Her mother suddenly started taking great interest in her only daughter. She knew Titus would improve the whole family's station, and so she began to counsel her in the ways of a woman. She taught her the proper etiquette of entertaining, and when their father came home for a visit, he gave permission for them to marry. Cassia never thought to whether she loved this man or not. She only knew she felt lonely without her brothers. She knew she hated living with her mother. She knew he was kind to her and lavished her with gifts and compliments. She knew she had only to ask and she would be given anything she desired. So when the day of their wedding arrived, she wore a beautiful gown, and her hair was adorned with flowers. She was compared to Aphrodite by the wedding guests, and she smiled and laughed throughout the entire event. All of the Senate had been invited, and Caesar himself came for the event. Both of her parents were there and beamed with pride at how well she had married. She missed her brothers that day and wished they could have come, but it had been impossible to get word to them. She might have remained happy and grown to love her husband had he been a different man. Their wedding night was to change her forever. Her mother had explained to her about the marriage bed and her duties as a wife. Cassie had felt nervous but prepared. Nothing could have prepared her for her husband's appetite. Titus had been a slave trader since he was born. His mother had died of fever when he was a child, so he was raised on his father's slave ships. The sailing horror vessels became his playground. The violence and perversion he saw on a daily basis ruined him from developing a normal idea of love and intimacy. As he grew, he remained unchecked in the atrocities he was allowed to carry out on his slaves. The crew would laugh and cheer him on from the time he was young, and so this had become his normal. His appetites only became more perverted as he grew into a man. No man, woman, or child was safe with him. The law in Rome was very clear, and the citizen could do whatever he wished to his slaves or wife. They were his property to do with as he saw fit. Cassia was spared most things in the beginning. He kept his perversions with her to a minimum because she was expected to carry his child. Month by month, though, his treatment worsened as she did not become pregnant. Every time her monthly blood would flow, he would introduce a new perversion on her. After a year, she no longer had his mercy in any way. She was sequestered to the house unless she was to accompany him to a party. She was allowed to carry out her social obligations only because he wanted a Senate seat. Her mother was allowed to visit and brought all manner of pagan fertility treatments. Her mother ignored her daughter's diminishing appearance and the bruises all over her body. She focused on how Cassia could be a better wife. She tried to ask her mother for help, but it fell on deaf ears. Albina had no interest in helping her except to make her pregnant. Her father visited on one occasion. She had fallen to the floor and held the bottom of his robes while she begged him to help her. He explained that Titus was the man and could do as he pleased. Titus provided her parents with a new home, and they would not speak against him. Her father told her to be a better wife and a more accommodating to her husband's needs. She later learned that Titus had paid for her father to obtain a commander position. He wanted his own regiment and put her father in charge of it. She lived this life of suffering, and not even her slaves would console her. They knew all too well what he was capable of, and offered the lady of the house no sympathies. They had all endured his abuses, and at least she was allowed out on occasion. He had hurt one of the slaves so badly she climbed to the roof and jumped off, ending her own life. To all of society she looked like a privileged wife of a wealthy man, and many girls were jealous of her. It was a fate they had all dreamed of. She knew she had no power in her situation, and endured it because she had no other choice. In the years since the change, she came to realize one thing about that time in her life. Titus most likely had been the barren one. He had been over 40 when they married and never sired an offspring. She knew he bedded the house slaves constantly, and not one of them had ever become pregnant either. She knew in those times that males did not consider if they were the problem. It was a woman's fault if no children were born. Men had no responsibility, even if it was them that were sterile. Finally, her brothers were home and allowed to visit. She found this curious, as Titus had never allowed them before, but delighted nonetheless. When they walked through the door, she felt her world was right once more. She hardly recognized the two men who stood in her doorway, both still dressed in their uniforms. Gone was the baby face of Julius. Instead, a sculpted man's face had taken his place. He had blond stubble around his jawline, and his hand rested on his sword hilt. His awkward teen body had been turned into a hardened mass of muscle, and now he stood taller than even their father. Marcus had a new stern look about him and a full beard. He was more muscular than Julius, and his arms looked like tree trunks. He stood with his hands behind his back, and Cassia would notice through the centuries he would continue to stand like this. While she'd been noticing their changes, they noticed hers. They had expected her to have become fat from her cushioned life and to beam with happiness. Instead, the version of her that stood before them was shocking. She looked haggard and gaunt. Dark circles ringed her eyes. She was wearing expensive clothing and jewelry, but looked like a beggar in the street. Her once bright eyes no longer had a spark to them, and bruises covered her arms and neck even. They could see the spots where fingers had gripped her flesh too tightly, and shuddered to think what had made the other marks. Julius was instantly enraged and started to take a step forward. He intended to kill the man standing by his sister looking smug. He had no care for what the consequences would be. He just wanted the man's eyes to bulge as he choked the life from him. Marcus had fought countless battles with his brother and knew exactly what he was thinking, and quickly grabbed his arm to stop him. They would take care of this problem, but not in front of their sister. She should not have to see such things. To Titus and Cassia, it looked like they wanted to be the first to hug their sister, and it was Cassia who stepped forward first. Marcus stepped forward to shake the hand of Titus and greet him. Julius gathered his crying sister into his arms, and as they embraced, he whispered softly into her ear while Marcus had Titus distracted. "We are here now, and nothing more will happen to you." Cassia only wept harder. She relaxed into his arms, and for the first time in a long time, felt relief. Cassia had shielded him all these years, and now he would shield her. Titus admonished Cassia for weeping like a child, and she immediately dried her eyes. Julius insisted Cassia show them their magnificent house, while Marcus begged to see the stables and courtyard of the fine home. The brothers tried to keep them apart as much as they could. Marcus feigned interest in Titus's business and current Senate campaign. They used flattery and compliments all day on him. Titus seemed so taken with the brothers, he invited them to stay when he found out Albina had refused for Julius to stay in their new home. They explained that they had planned on taking rooms nearby. As they washed and changed for dinner, they concocted a plan on how to deal with Titus. As they lay out on their couches, eating and drinking, Titus helped their plan by insisting they should go into the city after their meal. He had assumed that soldiers fresh from the battlefield would like to do some drinking and keep the company of women. They both congratulated Titus on a wonderful idea, and he soon sent Cassia off to bed. As Cassia bent down to kiss her husband goodnight, he grabbed her wrist and pulled her down to whisper something in her ear. Her brothers saw her stiffen, but pretended they saw nothing. It didn't matter what he said. Those would be the last words he ever spoke to her. It was not until centuries later that Marcus had remembered the incident and asked her what Titus had said to her on that night. She told her brothers that he had whispered to her that he was going to get her brothers drunk and have them loaded onto one of his ships to Carthage, because white slaves sold for a premium there. He had then kissed her on the cheek and smirked. Titus had been asked recently by Marcellus and Albina to rid them of Julius for once and all. He had agreed, and although he knew they would be upset that Marcus had also disappeared, he knew he owned them and they would say nothing about it. The three men went to an establishment that sold both alcohol and women. Titus bought a pitcher after pitcher of wine and commenced to getting them all drunk. Marcus and Julius pretended to drink much more than they actually did. Soon enough, Titus bought them all women and instructed the women to pour powder in their drinks when they were in their rooms alone. Titus had long ago secured a power that made his slave trade much easier. Sleeping people didn't fight until they woke up chained, and by then it was too late. Julius let Marcus and Titus retire upstairs first, and then waited patiently for Marcus to return. He waited no longer than 10 minutes, and Marcus came down the stairs to jeers from the girls. The entire place soon joined in, as Marcus had been unable to perform and was too embarrassed to stay and drink more. Julius looked as if he had to carry him onto the street. Once there, Marcus straightened up and headed back for the house of Titus. He was to make noise, so everyone thought they had both come home together. They had needed everyone to remember them leaving early, and what better way for a crowd to remember them than through humiliation. Julius waited in a dark alley for over 3 hours before Titus emerged. He was stumbling a little, and he was furious that the brothers had left early. 4 of his men had been waiting for his signal to come carry the brothers to the ship and set sail, but he sent them away. He would have to try again tomorrow. Julius followed him until they neared a sewer system. He knocked him over the head and dragged him inside. Julius knew Marcus had no real stomach for what he was going to do. In battle, Marcus would defend himself with deadly force, but he never struck first. He had learned how to ease his conscience by only defending, never attacking. Julius would always strike first, and it was never a burden to his conscience. He wasn't sure he had one. That was the fundamental difference between the brothers. Through the centuries, the 3 of them would gain a reputation for being heartless and killing without remorse. But this was the only true of Julius. Cassia had a heart that was very fragile indeed, and Marcus was a prisoner of his conscience. They were only thought of this way because of Julius, and they let their reputation stand because it helped keep their enemies at bay. Julius did not spare Titus any pain that night, and made sure before he died he knew exactly why he was dying. The mighty Titus, who had terrorized people almost his entire life, wept and begged for his life. He promised to free Cassia, and he promised to make the brothers rich men. He could not understand how anyone would turn down money. In the end, he finally understood how his many slaves and his wife felt, but he died without remorse. So black and twisted had his heart become. In the early afternoon, a senator came to break the news to Cassia that her husband had been found murdered. Well, parts of him had been found. Inquiries were made, but they were just a formality. Everyone had remembered the brothers leaving early because of Marcus. The staff had recalled them both coming home early and terribly drunk and crashing around. Cassia confirmed that she had spoken to them both. In the end, it was decided that Titus had been set upon by a savage pack of thieves. Julius and Marcus stayed with Cassia while she had Titus cremated. No formal service was held, as Titus had no real family and no real friends. Besides, Cassia did not want to spend a penny on anyone remembering him. She dumped his ashes in the sewer, and the world would never remember that Titus Aurelius had ever existed, except faintly in Cassia's long-removed memory. Cassia had Marcus dissolve Titus's businesses and set all the slaves free that he owned. The Roman Empire took all his properties due to taxes, they said, but gave Cassia a small monthly stipend. She could retain it until she remarried. She had many suitors who had shown interest in her, but never again in her mortal life would she consider any of them. She was determined she would never let a man control her fate again. She would never be powerless again. It was almost 3 years after that night that her brothers came to change her. She had been by their side ever since. They had never spoken of what happened to her, and she would never speak of certain things to anyone. They had seen enough to know she was being hurt, but if they had known the extent, she knew Julius would have crossed the floor that day, and Marcus would not have held his arm to stop him. She looked at her two brothers, the only people she had ever loved, and watched as they spoke of Sawyer. She watched their faces and was happy to see Julius smile, even if it was only for a second. He had stopped smiling as a child, and while she understood, she often wished she could see it again. She was grateful to see it now. She hoped they would both enjoy the next 2 months, and hoped her family would remain friends with her. She held no hope that it would be either of her brothers. She had seen how easily Sawyer and Lucas interacted, and it seemed his temperament matched hers. She was almost certain that Lucas was her soulmate.